Sometime between 732 and 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire conquered the kingdom of Samaria and what is now Israel. During the occupation, the Assyrians engaged in mass deportations of those living there to the heart of their empire in Mesopotamia. Although there is some dispute as to which ruler actually led the conquest, Sargon II claimed, quote, "In my first year of reign, the people of Samaria, to the number of 27,290 I carried away. 50 chariots for my royal equipment I selected. The city I rebuilt. I made it greater than it was before. The people of the land I conquered, I settled therein. My official tartan I placed over them as governor." In addition to those who were taken to Mesopotamia, estimates are around 80,000 others fled to the south to the kingdom of Judah. Survivors who stayed often intermarried with foreign invaders, but some of the tribes were decimated to the point that the last reference to them in historical accounts came prior to the invasion. Around 586 BC, the kingdom of Judah was conquered by the Babylonians, and so more were forcibly deported to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar II, including the king of Judah. Unlike most ethnic and religious groups of the time, the Jews proved to be remarkably resistant to assimilation. But because of these pressures placed on their traditional homeland, many Jewish settlers relocated throughout the Mediterranean. Historical records show a Jewish enclave of some size or another in nearly every major Mediterranean Sea city of the time. Jewish uprisings in what is now Israel allowed for a period of Jewish autonomy following the Maccabean revolt, but in 63 BC, Rome conquered Jerusalem and made the area more or less a Roman client state. As a result of the invasion, thousands of prisoners of war were taken to Rome, where a large Jewish settlement emerged on the right bank of the Tiber River. Under Roman rule, Jewish uprisings continued, but Rome continued to control the area. Each failed uprising meant more Jews were captured and dispersed throughout the Roman Empire, either as prisoners, slaves, or both. Eventually, Roman Emperor Hadrian sent a massive force to crush Jewish dissent once and for all. Roman historian Cassius Dio wrote of Hadrian's invasion, quote, 50 of their most important outposts and 985 of their most famous villages were razed to the ground. 580,000 men were slain in the various raids and battles, and the number of those that perished by famine, disease, and fire was past finding out. Thus nearly the whole of Judea was made desolate. Following this brutal invasion, Jewish people were banned from entering Jerusalem and the surrounding area for all but one day a year. According to the writing of St. Jerome, Hadrian, quote, commanded that by legal decree and ordinances the whole nation should be absolutely prevented from entering from thenceforth even the district round Jerusalem, so that it could not even be seen from a distance its ancestral home. He also wrote, quote, in Hadrian's reign, when Jerusalem was completely destroyed and the Jewish nation was massacred in large groups at a time, with the result that they were even expelled from the borders of Judea. Eusebius later wrote, quote, all the families of the Jewish nation have suffered pain worthy of wailing and lamentation, because God's hand has struck them, delivering their mother city over to strange nations, laying their temple low, and driving them from their country to serve their enemies in a hostile land. So many Jewish people were sold into slavery that one source reported the price for a Jewish slave could be sold, quote, for the price of a daily portion of food for a horse. Between the forced deportation, enslavement, and just people attempting to escape the slaughter, the Jewish diaspora grew to the point that temples and settlements where Jews could worship could be found in most major cities in the Roman Empire. Some estimated that the number of Jews living in Rome at its peak was between 4.5 and 7 million. It's estimated that another million Jews lived outside of the empire, with some fleeing toward Jewish communities in Babylon. So many Jews had relocated there, some have argued that between the 3rd and the 7th century, there may have been more Jews in the Babylonian Jewish community than remained in the settlements of Israel itself. Following the conversion of Constantine, Israel became more and more occupied by Christians. This continued after the Roman Empire split, and what was Judea became part of the Byzantine Empire. By the 5th century, Jews had become a minority group even within the former kingdom of Israel itself. But while most other non-Christian religions in the area were banned, Jews were still permitted to continue to practice and worship openly. They were the only religious group that was legally permitted to worship under Byzantine rule that was not a Christian one. But this isn't to say the Jewish people were given treatment equal to Christians. Jews were still prohibited from opening new temples, holding public office, or owning slaves, at least legally. As a result, many Jews sought to restore their homeland in Israel. Around 614 AD, Jewish rebels allied with the Sasanian Empire, from what is now Iran, on the promise that Sasanians would help them restore a Jewish homeland. Initially, their combined forces were able to retake Jerusalem, but the Sasanians failed to keep their promise to allow the Jewish rebels autonomy. As a result, the Jewish rebels switched sides after being given several promises by the Byzantine Empire if they helped overthrow the Sasanians. But once the Byzantines were back in power, they broke their promise and ordered the Jewish population to be massacred for their betrayal, which led even more to flee. Around the same time, a new force was emerging in the region, which would challenge both the Byzantine and Sasanian empires, the Islamic Caliphate. Starting around 632, the Caliphate began to push both the Byzantine and Sassanid forces out. By 638, the entire area that makes up modern Israel was under the control of the Caliphate. At least initially, this improved conditions for the Jewish community. Jews were legally permitted to enter Jerusalem after previously being restricted for the last 500 years by the various rulers, but they remain a minority, and as more and more Muslims moved to the area, by 717, new laws were added giving restrictions and taxes to non-Muslim farmers, which forced many Jews to move into urban areas, if not leave the area entirely. Jews in Western Europe found themselves facing a Catholic Church that was built on hostile foundations toward Judaism, despite Jesus himself being a Jew. St. John Chrysostom wrote a series of homilies entitled Adversus Judaeos, or Against the Jews. He wrote, quote, "Many I know respect the Jews and think their present way of life is a venerable one. This is why I hasten to uproot and tear out this deadly opinion. I said that the synagogue is no better than a theater, and I bring forward a prophet as my witness. Surely the Jews are not more deserving of belief than their prophets. You had a harlot's brow, you became shameless before all. Where a harlot has set herself up, that place is a brothel. But the synagogue is not only a brothel and a theater, it is also a den of robbers and a lodging for wild beasts. Jeremiah said, 'Your house has become for me the den of a hyena.' He does not simply say of a wild beast, but of a filthy wild beast. And again, I have abandoned my house, I have cast off my inheritance. But when God forsakes a people, what hope of salvation is left? When God forsakes a place, that place becomes the dwelling of demons." Catholic scholar St. Jerome wrote, quote, "The ceremonies of the Jews are harmful and deadly to Christians." He also wrote, quote, "My enemies are the Jews. They have conspired in hatred against me, crucified me, heap evils of all kinds upon me, blasphemed me." By around 600 AD, the Visigoths controlled much of the Iberian Peninsula, as well as some of what is now southern France, and had converted from Arianism to Catholicism. In 613, the ruler of the Visigoths ordered the Jewish people of his kingdom to convert to Christianity, and in 616 made clear that those who refused would be whipped, leading many to flee to France or North Africa. Others stayed behind but practiced their faith in secret. These repressions later led many Jews to collaborate with the Islamic Caliphate when they came to conquer the peninsula around 711 AD. In Eastern Europe, the Byzantine Emperor Leo III similarly attempted to force conversion by ordering the baptism of Jews and Christians practicing an unauthorized version in 722 AD. Throughout the rest of Europe, many craft guilds forbade Jews from joining, and in many kingdoms, laws prevented them from buying or owning land. This severely limited the economic opportunities for Jews, and being ethnic minorities, there was little they could do to change any of the laws. With limited options, Jewish communities tended to focus on and collaborate with industries they were not excluded from. For example, documents show that in southern Italy and Greece, Jewish communities had near monopolies in the silk weaving and dyeing industry, as there was no competitive craft guild which could exclude them. But there was one specific industry where the Jewish faith was an advantage. Catholic and Islamic doctrine at the time held that money lending for interest was a sin, but this was not a restriction for Jews. As a result, they were able to work in industries that involved money lending. In addition to direct loans, this included investment in general in things like mortgages, rental properties, and insurance. And while this was a path to financial prosperity for some Jews, it was also a source of tension and resentment when debts needed collection or rents went unpaid. In 1095, Pope Urban II gave a speech where he called for Christians to reclaim the Holy Land, reportedly saying, quote, "This land which you inhabit, shut in on all sides by the seas and surrounded by mountain peaks, is too narrow for your large population. Nor does it abound in wealth, and it furnishes scarcely food enough for its cultivators. Hence it is that you murder one another, that you wage war, and that frequently you perish by the mutual wounds. Let therefore hatred depart from among you. Let your quarrels end, let wars cease, and let all dissension and controversy slumber. Enter upon the road to the Holy Sepulchre. Wrest that land from the wicked race, and subject it to yourselves. God has conferred upon you above all nations great glory and arms. Accordingly, undertake this journey for the remission of your sins, with the assurance of the imperishable glory of the kingdom of heaven." Different accounts indicate that he went on to say, quote, When an armed attack is made upon the enemy, let this one cry be raised by all the soldiers of God. It is the will of God. It is the will of God. And quote, all who die by the way, whether by land or by sea, or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins. This I grant them through the power of God, which I am invested. While there is a dispute over the exact wording of the speech, the slogan, Deus Vult, Latin for God wills it, became a rallying cry for the first Crusaders. While the intent was primarily to unify Christian kingdoms and to encourage a military expedition to reclaim land lost to the Islamic expansion in both the Iberian Peninsula and the Middle East, many also took this message as a justification of the mass murder of Jews. That these murders were often a way to avoid repayment of debt that was incurred as part of the Crusades was probably not a coincidence. In 1096, mobs of French and German Christians engaged in mass murders of Jews in their community. A historian at the time wrote, quote, I do not know if it was because of a judgment of God or because of some delusion in their minds, but the pilgrims rose in a spirit of cruelty against the Jews who were scattered throughout all the cities, and they inflicted a most cruel slaughter on them, especially in the kingdom of Lotharingia, claiming that this was the beginning of their crusade and service against the enemies of Christianity. In just a few months, estimates are between 4,000 and 12,000 Jews were murdered throughout the area in what became to be known as the Rhineland Massacres. When the Crusaders reached Jerusalem, they killed both Muslims and Jews in the city and the surrounding area indiscriminately. One account wrote, the Jews assembled in their synagogues, and the Franks burned it over their heads. Some of the Jewish survivors were taken prisoner and sold into slavery. In 1120, likely in response to the massacres of Jews, the Catholic Church issued a papal bull entitled Sicut Judaeis, which translates to, as the Jews. It forbade Christians from doing harm to Jews, attempting to force them to convert, or disturbing their religious celebrations and desecrating their cemeteries. While this doctrine was reaffirmed many times by many popes, it was not always followed by the followers, and there were still legal restrictions on being Jewish. For example, in order to enforce laws against sexual intercourse between Jews and Christians, in 1215, a decree was issued by the Church stating, quote, we decree that such Jews and Saracens of both sexes in every Christian province, and all times, should be marked off in the eyes of the public from other people through the character of their dress. This was later clarified in 1227, stating, quote, that Jews may be distinguished from others, we decree, and emphatically command that in the center of their breast, of their garments, they shall wear an oval badge, the measure of 1 finger in width, and 1/2 a palm in sight. This type of discrimination was not exclusive to Europe, nor did these laws originate in Europe. Islamic legal documents from northern Africa and then Islamic-occupied Sicily from 1121 also stated, quote, 2 yellow badges are to be displayed, one on the headgear and one on the neck. Furthermore, each Jew must hang around his neck a piece of lead weighing 3 grams with the word dhimmi on it. It also has to wear a belt around his waist. The women have to wear 1 red and 1 black shoe and have a small bell on their necks or shoes. Forced conversion events were documented in Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen during this time, with reports of a Muslim mob killing approximately 6,000 Jews in 1033 in an event known as the Fez Massacre. There was more or less no place where the Jews were not an at-risk minority in the Christian or Islamic world, which was, for all intents and purposes for Jews, the entire available world. And so this made them the ideal scapegoats for any problem which might arise. While not the position of the Catholic Church itself, many medieval Christians began to place blame for the crucifixion not on the Romans and Pontius Pilate, but on the Jewish people. In England, this belief morphed into claims that Jews engaged in blood ritual sacrifices. Following the stabbing death of a boy in 1144, a monk claimed that his death was the result of ritual murder by Jews, with one chronicle stating, quote, in his time, the Jews of Norwich brought a Christian child before Easter and tortured him with all the same tortures with which our Lord was tortured, and on Long Friday hanged him on a cross for love of our Lord, and afterwards buried him. Imagine that it would be concealed, but our Lord showed that he was a holy martyr, and the monks took him and buried him reverently in the minster. And through our Lord he performs wonderful and manifold miracles, and he is called Saint William. The belief in this became so widespread that pilgrims began to come to William's local church, and when the Second Crusade began in 1189, over the next year there were massacres of Jewish people in York, Northampton, and London. In 1275, the first King Edward passed the Statute of the Jewry, which in addition to putting restrictions on where Jews could live, stated, quote, each Jew, after he is 7 years old, shall wear a distinguishing mark on his outer garment, that is to say, in the form of 2 tables joined, of yellow felt, the length of 6 inches, and of the breadth of 3 inches. It also added taxes on all Jews over the age of 12, and declared all debts to Jews were forfeit. In 1290, an edict of expulsion was ordered against all Jews in England on July 18th, which was the date of the Jewish holiday commemorating the destruction of Jerusalem. Conveniently, all property and possessions of the expelled Jews became property of the King of England. In France, in 1182, Jews were first ordered to be expelled from Paris, with this expanded to all of France by King Louis IX in 1254. While Jews were allowed to return over time in exchange for added taxes, every few generations a new expulsion was ordered, repeating the cycle until 1394, Charles VI declared his expulsion was irrevocable. In 1298, in what is now Germany, a mob went from town to town, executing between 20,000 and 100,000 Jews in over 140 separate communities, in what became known as the Rindfleck massacres. Similar mass executions took place in what is now France and Spain, initially targeting Muslims as part of an ethnic cleansing campaign following the retaking of the Iberian Peninsula, but later expanded to kill hundreds of Jews in the area as well. When the plague began to spread across Europe in the mid-1300s, once again Jews were scapegoated and targeted. Starting in 1348, all across Western Europe, Jewish communities were targeted and massacred, often by burning. On February 14, 1349, in Strasbourg, Germany, an estimated 6,000 Jews were burned alive on rumors that the plague was spread by Jews poisoning the wells. In Frankfurt, a Jewish community of around 3,000 attempted to defend themselves in the segregated ghetto where they were forced to live, but they were eventually overwhelmed and murdered by a Christian mob. The Catholic Church and Pope continued to condemn these massacres, with Pope Clement VI issuing a papal bull urging clergy to protect the Jews. But a decree by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV that all property of Jews killed in the various riots would be forfeited added a financial incentive for local authorities to look the other way. In Prague in 1389, during Easter, approximately 3,000 Jews were accused of desecrating sacramental bread and were murdered. In 1391 in Spain, a series of massacres took place across 70 cities, with death estimates reaching as high as 50,000, with reportedly another 100,000 agreeing to forced conversion and baptism. In Valencia specifically, crowds overwhelmed royal guards sent to protect the Jewish community. Of the estimated 2,500 Jews living in the city, 2,300 were killed, the remaining 200 forced to convert to avoid death. Eventually, the Catholic Church simply ceased to try to convince its followers to stop their attacks on the Jewish community. In 1475, a child who came to be known as Simon of Trent was found dead in Italy. After the body was discovered, members of the local Jewish community were tortured until they gave a confession to the child's murder. 15 Jews were then burned at the stake. In 1476, Pope Sixtus IV issued a papal bull authorizing Spanish officials power to deal with those who, quote, revert to the rites and customs of the Jews, to keep the dogmas and precepts of the Jewish superstition and perfidy. But the Spanish royalty went far beyond this limited scope, starting what came to be known as the Spanish Inquisition. In 1482, the Pope issued another bull attempting to restrain the violence, writing, quote, in Aragon, Valencia, Majorca, and Catalonia, the Inquisition has for some time been moved not by zeal for the faith and the salvation of souls, but by lust for wealth, and that many true and faithful Christians, on the testimony of enemies, rivals, slaves, and other lower and even less proper persons, have without any legitimate proof been thrust into secular prisons, tortured and condemned as relapsed heretics, deprived of their goods and property, and handed over to secular arm to be executed, to the peril of souls, setting a pernicious example and causing disgust to many. But King Ferdinand of Spain largely ignored the Pope's call for restraint, writing back, quote, take care, therefore, not to let the matter go further, and to revoke any concessions and entrust us with the care of this question. In 1492, Jews in Spain were given a choice of baptism or expulsion, leading to an estimated 160,000 to flee. In 1536, many who fled to Portugal found themselves involved in a Portuguese Inquisition. Even in the Papal States themselves, Jews were forced in segregated ghettos in 1555. During this time, the Catholic Church was facing challenges from the Protestant Reformation, led by Martin Luther in Germany. But Luther was no ally to the plight of the Jews, writing a pamphlet which translated to, quote, On the Jews and Their Lies, in 1543. In this pamphlet, he advocated for Jewish schools and synagogues to be burned, and described Jews as, quote, these poisonous, envenomed worms, and writing, quote, we are at fault in not slaying them. With all of this going on, Jewish communities in Western Europe largely went into hiding or professed Christian beliefs where possible to avoid persecution. Some moved to more tolerant areas of Eastern Europe, where they were able to worship and create openly Jewish communities. In many areas of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Jewish communities were able to grow and thrive to the point that many Jews referred to Poland as Polonia, which in Hebrew sounds like Here dwells God. They took this as a good omen. But this isn't to say the Jews in the Commonwealth were treated as equals or that they were safe. In 1648, during a rebellion by Ukrainian Cossacks, tens of thousands of Jews were killed in a pogrom in what is now eastern and southern Ukraine. Still, relative to other places in Europe, the Polish-Lithuanian state allowed Jewish communities to exist openly. A rabbi living in Poland wrote, quote, "Most of the time the Gentiles do no harm. On the contrary, they do right by Israel." By 1765, there were an estimated 750,000 Jews living in the Commonwealth, which some believe was more than half of the total estimated 1.2 million Jews living worldwide. This was also the area where the Hasidic movement began in the mid-1700s. While the Jewish diaspora was spreading throughout Europe, another group of people without a homeland began arriving, likely from areas that are now Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and possibly northern India based on linguistic and genetic evidence. These people came to be known as the Romani, or Roma people. Unlike nearly every culture in the world, the Romani make no claim to having a lost homeland, nor do they call for a sovereign nation, as travel and freedom are intrinsic to their culture. Starting in the 1300s, documents began to describe groups of people engaged in fortune-telling and palm reading, either being acknowledged or ordered to be expelled from various areas around the Balkans and Germany. In 1323, an Irish friar wrote of the Romani, quote, "We also saw outside the city a tribe of people who worship according to the Greek rite, and assert themselves to be of the race of Cain. These people rarely or never stop in one place for more than 30 days, but always, as if cursed by God, are nomad and outcast. After the 30th day they wander from field to field with small, oblong, black, and low tents, like those of the Arabs, and from cave to cave, because the place inhabited by them becomes after the term of 30 days so full of vermin and other filth that it is impossible to live in their neighborhood." By the 1500s, records showed orders for expulsion in Germany in 1416, Milan in 1493, France in 1504, Sweden in 1525, and England in 1530. In Switzerland and England, these laws included orders for the execution of Romani if they refused to leave the country willingly. By 1596 in England, some grace was given to allow them to stay and travel. Similar laws were passed in France in 1683, and later in Russia, Catherine the Great declared that they should be considered, quote, "crown slaves," which despite the name actually gave them greater freedom than the Russian serfs, as serfs were not permitted to travel without the permission of their landlord. But these loosening of laws against them tended to be exceptions rather than the rule. In the area that encompasses modern-day Romania, many were enslaved. In the late 1600s, the Portuguese expelled many Romani to Brazil, but the Spanish did not believe this was sufficient. So in 1749, Spain ordered a general imprisonment of, quote, gypsies. Jesuit confessor to Ferdinand V wrote of the plan, quote, "The means proposed by the governor of the council to root out this bad race, which is hateful to God and pernicious to man, seems good to me. The king will be making a great gift to God our Lord if he manages to get rid of these people." Around the same time in England, a debate in the English Parliament was occurring around the writing of the Jewish Naturalization Act of 1753 to discuss if Jewish people should be given citizenship rights. This was likely not out of the goodness of the heart of the crown, but likely due to Jewish financial support of the English government against the Jacobite uprising. During the debate, the so-called Jewish question was formally referenced for the first time in government documents. Ethnic groups without a homeland, such as the Jews, did not fit into the new Enlightenment nation-state world that was being created. Since Spain had begun colonizing the Americas, Europe had been shifting from alliances of kingdoms toward major empire on the path to what would become the modern nation-state. But implicit in this shift was the idea of a shared cultural state, for which your actions against those not of your state could be rationalized. At first, atrocities committed by colonial powers were justified on behalf of religion, saying that you could justify war as a crusade against non-believers. When over time those conquered were forced to accept your religion, your rationalization shifted to ethnicity and culture. Fighting for your homeland, your country, was enough rationalization for the evil deeds of conquest. Eventually, it expanded to the creation of a racial identity to justify why it was acceptable to enslave those who shared your religion, language, and cultural norms. But where does that leave people without a homeland? People who differ from you religiously, raised in different cultural traditions. This was, for much of Europe, described as the Jewish question. Jewish people were, of course, asking the same question from a very different perspective, but with few viable answers. Options in the Islamic world were equally bad, if not worse. Describing life for Persian Jews in the 1800s, an author wrote, quote, "They are obliged to live in a separate part of town, for they are considered as unclean creatures. Under the pretext of their being unclean, they are treated with the greatest severity, and should they enter a street inhabited by the Mussulmans, they are pelted by the boys and mobs with stones and dirt. For the same reason, they are prohibited to go out when it rains, for it is said the rain would wash the dirt off of them, which would sully the feet of the Mussulmans. If a Jew is recognized as such in the streets, he is subjected to the greatest insults. The passers-by spit in his face and sometimes beat him, unmercifully. If a Jew enters a shop for anything, he is forbidden to inspect the goods. Should his hand incautiously touch the goods, he must take them at any price the seller chooses to ask for them. Another author wrote of experiences traveling in the Middle East, quote, "I have seen a little fellow of 6 years old, with a troop of fat toddlers of only 3 and 4, teaching them to throw stones at a Jew, and one little urchin would, with the greatest coolness, waddle up to the man and literally spit upon his Jewish gabardine. To all this, the Jew is obliged to submit. It would be more than his life was worth to offer to strike a Mohammedan." In 1772, one of the few places where large Jewish settlements could exist in relative peace, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was invaded and partitioned by Prussia, Russia, and Austria. Prussian leader Frederick the Great wrote of the partition, quote, "It is a very good and advantageous acquisition, both from a financial and a political point of view. In order to excite less jealousy, I tell everyone on my travels I have seen just sand, palm trees, health, land, and Jews. Despite that, there is a lot of work to be done, there is no order and no planning, and the towns are in a lamentable condition." Austria more or less immediately revoked laws which had given the Jewish community a degree of autonomy, but otherwise they didn't specifically target Jewish communities relative to their neighbors. Over the next 100 years or so, between 1776 and 1910, the Jewish population grew from 144,000 to 870,000, with some cities having around a third of the population Jewish. In the Russian partition, Catherine the Great created what came to be known as the Pale of Settlement, with the Pale specifically meaning boundary. Jews were required to live within this boundary, which initially did expand the amount of territory available for Jews, but was accompanied by laws which restricted where they were able to do business, not just live. Over time, additional restrictions were added, such as restricting the teaching of Yiddish and leasing rights. There were also laws added to restrict movement, and because so much of the Jewish population already resided in the area, it remained one of the largest Jewish populations in the world. At its height, the Jewish population recorded in 1897 was around about 40% of the Jews living in the entire world, but they still only made up about 4.1% of the total Russian population. During the French Revolution in 1789, the French revolutionary government granted full citizenship to Jews, but given the long history of expulsion, the population in France was relatively small. But when Napoleon began to conquer much of Europe, the laws that granted Jewish citizenship were part of laws imposed by conquest. And while Napoleonic law technically made Jews full citizens in most of Western Europe and Germany, it did not make society more accepting or tolerant. And once Napoleon was defeated, in Germany, many anti-Semitic laws returned along with informal enforcements by mobs. The French Revolution also sparked reform movements against monarchy and toward constitutional governance and democracy. But class arguments were generally still framed around nation-state ideological lenses. In 1844, Karl Marx wrote an essay, the title of which translates to On the Jewish Question, in which he argued, quote, "As soon as society succeeds in abolishing the empirical essence of Judaism, huckstering at its conditions, the Jew becomes impossible, because his consciousness no longer has an object. The social emancipation of the Jew is the emancipation of society from Judaism." As German nationalist movements grew, any minority, including the Jewish minority, was viewed as a barrier to goals around cultural purity. These arguments joined with pseudoscientific arguments on race theory, which would eventually become the eugenics movement, with social Darwinists arguing Jews were not just a problem as an ethnic group to social unity, but an inferior race entirely. These kinds of arguments were not exclusive to Germany. In France, they came from more or less the oppositional ideological direction of Marx, and were led by French Catholic Royalist writers, who in large part wanted to undo the reforms of the French Revolution and restore the French Catholic monarchy. They aimed to nullify Napoleon's reforms around Jewish citizenship rights. In 1806, Louis de Bernard wrote a book which title translates to On Jews, in which he argued Jews were an alien race incapable of becoming French, describing the Jewish communities as, quote, "a state within a state," and calling for Jews to be forced to wear a mark so they could be identified more easily. Catholic author Louis Belloux argued that Jewish holy books demanded Jews hate all Christians and that Jews were plotting to control society, despite the reality that the Jews were a repressed minority regularly subjected to violence. Author Roger Gougenot de Musso furthered this argument in a book where he made the argument claiming that Jews were somehow responsible for the French Revolution. This book was blessed by Pope Pius IX and translated into German by future Nazi leaders. Jews, as before but on a larger scale, were the minority of choice to scapegoat, this time not for the Black Plague, but for problems which came from an industrializing world. The same system which prevented Jews from owning land, the dominant source of wealth prior to industrialization, had pushed a small number of Jewish families into the kinds of businesses which exploded in value in an industrialized world. And the idea that some members of this oppressed minority were able to become so wealthy and powerful challenged racial superiority narratives. And of course, rather than accept that the racial narratives were wrong and have to rethink beliefs they wanted to be true, many embraced elaborate, irrational conspiracy theories. And these conspiracy theories were useful distractions for leadership failures. When the French lost to Prussia in 1871, and Napoleon III was captured by the Prussian army, and the Prussian army was given a victory parade through Paris, despite the total French Jewish population being only 0.1% in a country of 38 million people, right-wing anti-Semitic newspapers created elaborate conspiracy theories to try to put the blame on the Jews rather than the French themselves. This was, of course, also not exclusive to France. In 1879, William Marr published a popular pamphlet which translated to The Way of Victory of Germanism over Judaism, where he argued Jews were winning a racial war against the German people and could never be assimilated because of racial differences. He argued that only one race could survive the ultimate conflict, this despite only roughly 1% of the total population of Germany being Jewish. In Russia, the government shrunk the size of the Pale settlement over time and became overtly anti-Semitic following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, based on a rumor of Jewish involvement that was tied mainly to one of the conspirators being married to a Jewish woman. For the next 3 years, pogroms broke out all across the Pale. The three largest occupied Kiev, Odessa, and Warsaw. This led to hundreds of deaths and widespread property destruction. The son of the assassinated Tsar, Alexander III, passed specific laws which directly and severely restricted where Jews could live and added quota restrictions on schools and universities, as well as in professions such as doctors and lawyers. The Tsar's minister stated that the goal for the Jewish population with the laws and reforms was that, quote, 1/3 will die out, 1/3 will leave the country, and 1/3 will be completely dissolved in the surrounding population. In 1903, in Kiev, a man born into a Hasidic Jewish family was accused of murdering a 13-year-old, reportedly as part of an elaborate blood ritual. When an anti-Semitic Catholic priest was called to testify, a police department official wrote, quote, the course of the trial will depend on how the ignorant jury will receive the arguments of priest Pranitis, who is sure about the reality of ritual murderers. I think as a priest he is able to talk with the peasants and convince them. As a scientist who defended a thesis about this question, he will give props to the court and prosecution, though nothing can be guessed in advance yet. I became acquainted with Pranitis, and I am firmly convinced he is the person who knows the problem, about which he will talk in depth. Everything, then, will depend on which arguments priest Pranitis will furnish, and he has them, and they're shattering for the jury. But the priest was unsuccessful, with another observer writing, quote, cross-examination of Pranitis has weakened evidentiary value of his expert opinion, exposing lack of knowledge of texts, insufficient knowledge of Jewish literature. Because of amateurish knowledge and lack of resourcefulness, Pranitis' expert opinion is of very low value. Although the Jewish man was acquitted of the crime, that same year and until 1906, anti-Jewish pogroms broke out across what is now Ukraine. A newspaper described an Easter pogrom in Kishinev in 1903 saying, quote, the mob was led by priests, and the general cry, kill the Jews, was taken up all over the city. The Jews were taken wholly unaware and were slaughtered like sheep. The dead number 120, and the injured about 500. The scenes of horror attending this massacre are beyond description. Babies were literally torn to pieces by the frenzied and bloodthirsty mob. The local police made no attempt to check the reign of terror. At sunset, the streets were piled with corpses and wounded. Those who could make their escape fled in terror, and the city is now practically deserted of Jews. Despite death tolls numbering in the thousands, the Russian government was unsympathetic, with the ambassador of the United States writing, quote, the situation in Russia, so far as the Jews are concerned, is just this. It is the peasant against the moneylender, and not the Russian against the Jews. There is no feeling against the Jew in Russia because of religion. It is, as I have said, the Jew ruins the peasant, with the result that conflict occurs, with the latter have lost all their worldly possessions and have nothing to live upon. Around the same time as the pogroms, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was published in Russia. The document claims to be the minutes of a meeting of Jewish leaders in the late 1900s, but the document makes references to events that would not have yet occurred if that were true, showing it's clearly a forgery. Later research into it found that much of the text had been copied from a French satire book written in 1864, which had nothing to do with Jews. The title of the French book translated to The Dialogue in Hell Between Machiavelli and Montesquieu. In the satirical book, the author imagined Machiavelli making a case for the need for despotism, in opposition to Monarchy, arguing for liberalism. The authors of the Protocol of Zion appear to have taken more or less the same text, only ascribing the words of Machiavelli arguing for despotism to, quote, Jewish elders. Despite the obvious forgery, and it being a plagiarized document, because it fit neatly into conspiracy narratives around Jewish power, it was translated into many languages and widely distributed throughout Europe. World War I hit Russian Jews particularly hard, as during the Russian Revolution, anti-Bolshevik forces specifically targeted Jews based on a belief that because some Bolshevik leaders were Jewish, their rise was part of a larger Jewish conspiracy. Estimates are between 100,000 and 250,000 Jews were killed during the so-called White Terror, particularly in what is now Ukraine, most often by Ukrainian nationalist groups. Even as the Red Bolsheviks pushed the White Army out of Ukraine, pogroms continued to target Jewish communities who the Bolsheviks viewed as part of the bourgeoisie class. At the end of the war, Poland emerged as a location where many Russian and Ukrainian Jews fled. Poland's population was more than 10% Jewish, which was a far higher percentage than any other country in Europe. There were even a few cities with Jewish majorities, which was more or less unheard of anywhere else in the world. By 1931, Warsaw alone had 350,000 Jews, and the country as a whole contained over 3.1 million Jews. But even in Poland, Jews were still an ethnic minority, and therefore subject to scapegoating for the massive economic collapse that came with the Great Depression. As it had happened regarding every major tragedy in Europe since before the Black Plague, Jews were used as a scapegoat by nationalist leaders to deflect blame. In Germany, when it was clear the war was lost, the military leaders who led the country into the doomed war sought to deflect blame by making the new civilian government co-sign the armistice agreements. As one German general, Erich Ludendorff, said, quote, I have asked His Majesty to include the government those circles who are largely responsible for things that have developed as they have. We will now see these gentlemen moved into the ministries. Let them be the ones to sign the peace treaty that must now be negotiated. Let them eat the soup they have cooked for us. The people of Germany, who had been given sanitized reporting throughout the war, proclaiming victory after victory, were shocked that they were not winning the war right up until the announcement. But in reality, absent surrender, Germany's major cities were weeks from destruction. A military theorist named Basil Lindahl Hart wrote in 1930 of the situation, quote, More truly significant was the decision on October 4th, after Austria's surrender, to prepare a concentric advance on Munich by 3 Allied armies, which would be assembled on the Austro-German frontier within 5 weeks. In addition, Trentard's independent air force was about to bomb Berlin, on a scale hitherto unattempted in air warfare. And the number of American troops in Europe now had risen to 2,085,000, and the number of divisions to 42, of which 32 were ready for battle. But rather than admit the harsh reality that the war was ill-conceived and they had lost it, the military leaders and conservative nationalists who had pressed for the war in the first place aggressively looked for ways to shift blame onto any scapegoat they could find, often arguing surrender itself was treason. German Colonel Max Bauer wrote in 1919, quote, The war was lost only and exclusively through the failure of the homeland. The far right argued that the German army was, quote, stabbed in the back. Right-wing leader Friedrich Ebert told the troops in November of 1918 that, quote, no enemy has vanquished you, and that, quote, they returned undefeated from the battlefield. Conservative newspapers took up the German lost cause narrative and wrote of the man who signed the armistice, quote, he may be as round as a bullet, but he is not bulletproof. And this was shown to be true when he was assassinated in 1921 by right-wing ultranationalists in broad daylight. Among the scapegoats as usual were the Jews. This despite that the Jews had actually fought in the war in a higher percentage than most Germans, and they still represented less than 1% of the population of Germany. In 1919, German politician Alfred Rosch published The Jew in the Army, in which he argued Jewish soldiers were spies and profiteers, and that Jewish officers never believed in the cause. General Ludendorff remained a major figure in right-wing circles as a leader of 2 failed coup attempts. The first in 1920, known as the Kapp Putsch, and along with Adolf Hitler, the more famous Bierhall Putsch in 1923. Hitler himself was nearly deported, being born in Austria and not having German citizenship at the time. As a result, he was also unable to run for office, despite leading the Nazi Party. Hitler took clear inspiration from Benito Mussolini's rise to power in Italy, and was trying to replicate Mussolini's march on Rome in his failed putsch. But it was not until the Great Depression spread to Europe in 1929 that the Nazi scapegoating of Jews, linking socialist and communist parties to Jewish conspiracies while claiming the greatness of true Germans, allowed them to grow into a major political force. The British ambassador to Berlin wrote, quote, Hitler may be no statesman, but he is an uncommonly clever and audacious demagogue, and fully alive to every popular instinct. In 1932, German parliament was unable to form a government because the Nazi Party and the Communist Party, despite openly despising each other, decided to combine to block more moderate parties from taking power. Having received the most votes, Hitler was able to convince German President Hindenburg to name him Chancellor. General Ludendorff, who by this time had broken with Hitler and the Nazis, reportedly wrote to Hindenburg of the appointment, quote, "I solemnly prophesy that this accursed man will cast our Reich into the abyss and bring our nation into inconceivable misery. Future generations will damn you in your grave for what you have done." Hitler used his power as Chancellor to suspend civil liberties following the Reichstag fire, which he blamed on the Communist Party. He used these emergency powers to eliminate political opposition and give his party control of the government, despite winning only 33% of the vote in November of 1932. Even with these powers and a campaign of violence during the election toward his political rivals, the Nazis were able to only win 43.9% of the vote. But that was enough to make sure there were no more free elections in Germany. Soon after taking power, the Nazis passed laws allowing them to remove, quote, undesirables from civil service positions, describing them as either unqualified, communist, or, quote, non-Aryan. They removed the ability for, quote, non-Aryans to take the bar exam or be medically licensed, and added racial quotas limiting the number of Jews in school to 1.5%. In July, they passed the denaturalization laws, which effectively removed citizenship for 150,000 Jews. They restored laws forbidding Jewish farming, with the law stating, quote, "The Reich government passes this law to secure the peasant foundations of our bloodline through instituting the ancient customs of land inheritance." In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws were passed. These laws stated that only those of German blood could be citizens, and that anyone who was more than half Jewish was not a citizen. It forbid intermarriage or sexual relations between those defined as German and those defined as Jewish, and indicated any child born of such a union going forward would be labeled as Jewish. The laws first imposed on Jews were expanded to include Romani, called gypsies in the law, and blacks in November of 1935. In 1938, Austria, where some German Jews had fled, was annexed by Germany, bringing with it all of the anti-Semitic laws. On November 9th and 10th, 1938, Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, took place all across Germany and Austria, with Nazi SS party members destroying Jewish businesses, homes, and places of worship, arresting around 30,000 Jewish men who were then sent to concentration camps. A reporter by the name of Hugh Green wrote of the event, quote, "Mob law ruled Berlin throughout the afternoon and evening, and hordes of hooligans indulged in an orgy of destruction. I have seen several anti-Jewish outbreaks in Germany during the last 5 years, but never anything as nauseating as this. Racial hatred and hysteria seem to have taken a complete hold of an otherwise decent people. I saw fashionably dressed women clapping their hands and screaming with glee, while respectable middle-class mothers held up their babies to see the fun." After the event, reportedly Nazi leaders met, and a transcript of the meeting mentioned, quote, "I have received a letter written on the Führer's orders requesting the Jewish question be now, once and for all, coordinated and solved one way or the other. I should not want to leave any doubt, gentlemen, as to the aim of today's meetings. We have not come together to merely talk again, but to make decisions, and I implore competent agencies to take all measures for the elimination of the Jew from the Jewish economy and to submit them to me." Soon after this meeting, Jews were forbidden from going to movies or theater, and their children banned from public schools. Over 100,000 Jews fled Germany and Austria, many to neighboring Poland. In Poland, the Jewish population continued to grow through the 1930s. Many of these were refugees fleeing violence and starvation in Ukraine, and of course others were fleeing the rising anti-Semitism brought on by the neighboring Nazi Germany. The population had reached over 3.3 million in late 1938. But this isn't to say the Jewish minority was accepted with open arms in Poland. Many Polish politicians and Catholic leaders called for finding ways to stop the Jewish immigration, as well as encouraging Jews to leave the country entirely. Polish officials proposed a so-called evacuation plan, intended to send 1.5 million Eastern European Jews, which would include 750,000 Polish Jews, to an English-controlled area in what is now Israel called Mandatory Palestine. Many in Poland supported national boycotts of Jewish businesses, and the government revoked citizens of tens of thousands of Jews living abroad, likely to prevent refugees from Germany and Austria coming back to Poland. All property owned by these Jews was confiscated by the state. A pro-government newspaper in Poland wrote in 1939, quote, "The fact that our relations with the Reich are worsening does not in the least deactivate our program in the Jewish question. There is not and cannot be any common ground between our internal Jewish problem and Poland's relations with the Hitlerite Reich." Nearby Czechoslovakia, a country formed as a result of World War I, also had a relatively large Jewish population of around 350,000 and a Romani population of around 100,000. Both were areas that Germany had ceded in World War I. Both were areas Nazis claimed belonged to Germany. In March of 1939, Germany invaded and occupied Czechoslovakia, imposing anti-Semitic laws upon the 450,000 combined Jews and Romani living there, with many being arrested and sent to concentration camps. In September of 1939, Germany invaded Poland from one side, and per an agreement between Stalin and Hitler, secretly signed in August, the Soviet Union invaded from the other side. Just over 60% of the Jews in Poland now found themselves under German control, and were immediately targeted for arrest and mass execution. In the Soviet-occupied area, estimates are between 100,000 and 300,000 Jews were reported from Poland deeper into the Soviet Union, most into forced labor camps known as gulags. By May of 1940, Germany invaded France, and by June, they had forced the French to sign an armistice conceding occupation of much of the country and demanding compliance from the remainder. Among the concessions were that the French must adhere to the anti-Semitic laws of Nazi Germany. At that time, there were 300,000 Jews living in France, many refugees from the Nazis. In addition, there were approximately 400,000 Jews living in French-occupied Algeria. As a result of the occupation, approximately 75,000 Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps, along with between 16,000 and 18,000 Romani. The invasion of Yugoslavia in April of 1941 brought approximately 300,000 Romani and 82,000 Jews under Axis control, and therefore subjected them to mass arrest and mass murder. In June of 1941, Germany and Italy broke their non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and invaded, occupying the majority of the Pale of the settlement and expanding the mass arrest and execution of Jews in these areas. Even as the tide of war turned against Germany in 1943, the Nazis were still devoting resources to deport 45,000 Jews from the occupied northern Greece to concentration camps in order to be executed. Even as Germany was losing ground elsewhere, they were able to occupy Hungary in March of 1944, and they devoted resources to arresting and deporting over 400,000 Jews to concentration camps in Germany, where 80% of them were killed on arrival, with the rest either put in forced labor camps or tortured during medical experimentation. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler, knowing the war was lost, committed suicide in a bunker in Berlin. On May 8th, Germany surrendered. In total, an estimated 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust, which was approximately one-third of the total worldwide Jewish population. Between 250,000 and 500,000 Romani were killed, with the estimates of the pre-war population of the Romani people being between 1 million and 1.5 million. History is awkward.